Today, we're going to be talking about building a foundation of an OT security program with the use of a proper asset inventory and how that can lead into multiple gains across your overall security program, including everyone's first need for understanding inventory, and that is assessing risk, how big it is, how widespread it is, how deep it is, how important it is. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. A little introduction to both who we are and who I am. Verve Industrial Protection is actually a fully integrated solutions provider. What that basically means is we started 30 years ago as automation engineers in doing DCS programming, PLC upgrades, primarily North American power. And that was the genesis of the initial company. About 15 years ago, we started getting asked by that same North American power industry to help with a response, automated platform or software response to emerging NERC regulations, which are compliance, but at least rooted in security. Obviously, there's more stringent security guidelines out there today. Fast forward to 15 years later, we now serve multiple industry verticals and globals around the world, from pharmaceutical to consumer packaged goods, refining, pipelines, automotive manufacturing, pulp and paper, water, wastewater, you name it. And we've grown significantly from North America, as mentioned, to global organizations. We do have real-time services, both pre and post security services. When I say pre and post, I mean pre in the form of helping to design network segmentation, backup solutions, restoration programs, incident response, gap analysis, program development, et cetera. And on the back end, we have a growing range of managed services to help keep the lights on and keep up with emerging trends and security guidelines, like in the TSA for North American pipelines, NERC, and then of course in Europe and other areas, things like NAS or emerging 62443 requirements. I myself have been building ICS programs for about 21 years now. I started a company called Matricon, where we built the ICS security consulting division. Started with assessments, which is the way that most people do things: paper assessment, figure out what's wrong, build a plan, move forward. I got some suggestions today that is well-intentioned, but maybe not as efficient as you could be, and hope to share those with you today. We then got bought by a company called Honeywell, and that gave me the opportunity to be in a global role and see everything from Saudi Aramco headquarters shortly after Shamoon to mom and pop pulp and paper in rural Canada. And I'm hoping to share some of those insights with all of you today through their session, as well as questions. We do have a chat session and a question and answer area. Any questions that you may want to ask, please put in there. We'll try to get to them by the end of the session. If not, we will follow up in writing. We are recording. We will be posting either this morning or this afternoon's recording, along with any questions and answers, and even the slide deck as well. So that will be taken care of later. So without further ado, let me drop in. I want to first start with a background. And I'm going to set up the topic a little bit and then circle back to some common theories. I'm going to start with problems and come back with possible solutions. And some of the stuff is foreshadowing, so you'll see it coming, but hopefully it's still of value to you. The background, of course, is that we know ICS threats are growing rapidly from targeted and non-targeted attacks. I don't like putting up big slides of FUD and trends, but if you look at any of the reports that come out annually by many of these security organizations, more and more risks are appearing, and more risks are specifically targeted at OT, and many or more are getting through, and many more are of the critical or severe type of risk. However, to achieve security, we have this huge inherited technical debt on the OT side. For years, we've been doing set and forget, plug and play, TCP/IP. Some of my earliest technical were troubleshooting, well-intentioned but poorly designed TCP/IP packets to connect plants together and make them smart. Well, we still have that legacy equipment in there that's hard to upgrade or touch or play with. And so we can't say we are going to be golden. We're going to build a standard. We need to look at a standard and to understand within that standard, what does done look like? What are we trying to achieve? Now, in every case, as I mentioned, most people want to start with an assessment. An assessment is as much or more trying to get a handle on what you have and how it's configured, which is where we start to introduce the notion of inventory. Achieving your roadmap requires close coordination between IT and OT, leveraging each one's strengths. So this is where, when there's a pure risk, and IT can say, here's what it's attacking or how it's attacking it, OT can say, well, I've got this many of those or that many of this. What are my options to protect it? Because I can't necessarily patch it or shut it down live if something should happen to it. excuse me, which means that the key to success is building what we call a think global and act local organization. The other trend underlying these challenges and what we're talking about today is as we increase risk, we're also simultaneously increasing technology on the plant floor and finding it increasingly difficult to get talented and capable people to fill the jobs to protect those systems. And so any way that we can aggregate view and visibility and put the power into the hands of a small and specialized team and extend that team as widely and as diversely across my fleet as possible, the better off we are at having a fighting chance to get this taken care of. But the foundation of any solution is a robust asset inventory and assessment, right? This is fundamentally, in my opinion, the most important aspect of a successful OT security program. Too many people are willing to take the easy button or do a cursory pass at it. And that is a warning. I joked earlier today in the previous session that it's like talking to my teenage kids. I can tell them till I'm blue in the face, or they can go and try it themselves the fast and easy way and then go back and do it a second time and realize that the old man was right, but I'm not allowed to say I told you so. So really, I want to make sure that we get every opportunity to try and make sure we do things right, knowing that there's not only an immediate need for inventory, but that inventory is one of the few things that you will come back to repeatedly throughout the entire evolution of your security program, either to build it or to maintain it. And I'll hopefully illustrate that for you today. So the agenda for today, I want to talk about objectives. What do I want to share with you? Why is getting it right so critical? I sort of just alluded to it now. What are the key components of inventory and then into assessment, right? Because inventory really is the launch pad into what do I have now? Now that I know what I have, what's at risk, how is it configured, what's on it, what's not on it, what's it doing, et cetera. There are, of course, key challenges to what we're trying to do here. There are OT and legacy and existing investment and topology challenges and whatnot. And there are options and suggestions. Obviously, I have my own personal opinion. It's maybe a little bit biased, but I think I can bear that out with evidence. So key takeaways. I want you to think ahead. What are you going to do? What are you going to want to do with an inventory? When I talked about what is done look like, what are we trying to achieve? And the question is, what is your definition of an inventory? Now, if you're reading ahead like many people do, you're already starting to see some indicators of what I think an inventory is. But it is clear to me, having done this for 21 years, that an inventory is not simply a list of IP addresses, MAC addresses, and potentially vendors. We need to know much more about that. We need to know asset data, we need to know third-party data, and we need to know metadata. Exactly what is the scope or context of this asset, because not all assets are created equal in OT. Anyone on this call, and I see a few names that are common that I'm going to be meeting in person soon, you all know which system, if it goes down, you're canceling your evening or weekend plans, right? You also know that sometimes finding these systems is a bit of a needle in a haystack in a big complex environment. And so the definition for me of inventory goes far beyond. Hopefully by the end of today, we have a much more robust and detailed appreciation for what a quote unquote inventory actually is. Another thing I want to make sure that you realize that don't trust just what you hear. You need to go direct to the source. And this is a nod to some of the noise in the market, or rather, I've been in this industry for 21 years. I've seen the silver bullet come twice, and in both times it's missed the mark significantly. The easy button is enticing and alluring, but it's not nearly as fulfilling as you're going to need it to be. The next one is, what about remediation? If I see someone saying, look, I just need inventory, I just need an assessment, they're focused on the immediate and the now. But once we uncover data and give it to you, what are you going to do about it? I once walked into a plant and the plant manager said, you're here to do an assessment. And you're going to tell me that I don't change passwords and I don't patch systems. How the hell does that help me? And that's an absolutely fair game, fair question. We need to make sure we understand not only what it is we're finding, but what are we going to do about it? And then, of course, where possible, to automate and update daily, or rather update automatically. One of the things I'm pushing back now on the traditional assessment path is that it's usually a paper-based assessment. Somebody comes in, does a checkbox, gives you a big report card with a bunch of red X's on it, and that inventory or that asset, that assessment immediately ages and therefore starts to devalue for you and your status. So why is this so hard and starting to get into some of the background? Asset inventory is like a cookie, or at least If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. So anyone who's familiar with the children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, the basic premise is if you give a mouse a cookie, the mouse will say, this is very delicious, but now I'm thirsty, may I have a glass of milk to wash it down? And then once he has a glass of milk, he'll want to look in a mirror to see if there's any crumbs on his face or has a milk mustache or what have you. And then maybe see that some of their hairs are out of place or their bangs are a little bit long and may want to trim, so they borrow some scissors. And then of course, all of that activity makes them tired, want to have a nap. You get the idea. The idea is that when you start with something and start to pull on a thread, you're going to be asked for more and more data. And I've got on the next slide, but really when you consider, well, how true can that be? The reality is right here in the IEC 62443 patch decision tree. You look at the recommended or usually the typical path of any operational environment to look at identification of patches and to figure out this decision tree. There's lots of different components we're going to want to know about an asset, its context, its function, to be able to answer these questions. For example, at the high end, right, we talk about an IT-OT convergence. Let's let IT do this. Look at the vulnerability footprint, tell me the impact, the exposure, what the deployment is, what the compensating controls might be. And that allows OT to make an informed decision once they go through their portion. Does this affect the ICS? If no, continue operations. If yes, perhaps we look for a workaround. Presence of compensating controls. Is a workaround available? If no, do we understand the risk relative to operations and can we live with it? And if the answer is no, need to find a way to either patch or, again, apply compensating controls if they exist, or is it all possible? So what does this mean for us in OT? It means that we need to not just understand inventory. We need to go far beyond inventory, from inventory to vulnerabilities into patches available for those vulnerabilities. And it sure wouldn't hurt if we could take the full list of patches and sub-filter that to vendor approved. Beyond that, we probably want to know how the devices are configured. So if we can pull some other levers rather than patching, which is often desired or the only optional path. And then that gets us into things like, do we know the users? So if I'm trying to compensate for Bluekeep without applying the patch, I'd like to be able to disable remote desktop and the user or the guest account if I can. Maybe I want to rely on my whitelisting or my antivirus or my backup status. Maybe I've got different network protections, but most importantly, how quickly do I need to act, or do I need to act at all? What is the impact of this asset to operations? Risk is contextual, unfortunately. Not everybody's 5-alarm fire is yours and vice versa. But without this wide and diverse set of data, I can't make informed decisions. And so if I'm looking today at simply let me know what I have for risk and vulnerabilities, and give me a report or just give me an inventory, which is IP and MAC address, I will have challenges when I come to incident response, to backup design. I'm not going to back up and store a daily full backup and a weekly offsite for all assets. I'm going to do that for critical assets, but redundant assets or non-important assets, they may get a monthly backup. And that's a reasonable risk acceptance for an organization that doesn't have an army of people to do this. You can't make those informed decisions if you don't get the data right in the first place. So what does it look like when it works? Here's an example of one of our power clients today. They have multiple generation facilities. They have 12 of them in total, various legacy coal-fired and some peakers. They have a central HQ headquarters located support team, small team. They need to understand and secure all their assets against what was at the time called the CSC 20, which is now, of course, CIS 18. And they need to start with inventory, but they required multiple data types and sources to act on data. They needed to not only identify what they had for CIS 18, but they had to apply as many of the controls as possible. So what they were able to do by pulling in a robust inventory, and I'll get more into how you do that and what the benefits are, but by having that robust inventory, they're able to prioritize remediation, whether it's actually a vulnerability, a raw vulnerability that has a CVS score and a patch availability, or compensating controls, or if it was access risks, remote access, shared logins, other accounts, configuration of the endpoints, or asset criticality. They were able, by building the appropriate inventory view, to go into all aspects of risk reduction or risk remediation, from relatively reactive patching and compensating controls, or what they call virtual patching, or proactive addressing remote access, shared logins, network zones, as well as how the devices were configured for least privilege. So Rod McNeil, I'm an Oilers fan. Sorry for the side note. I got a question asking if I'm cheering the Flames. Yes, I am from Edmonton, Matricon, and yes, I am an Oilers fan. Thanks, Rod. So what does a detailed inventory look like for me? Well, I want to get as much data as possible, okay? To be able to accommodate those things, this is the sort of inventory that client is looking at. They've got particular OS by vintage and lifecycle management. They've got manufacturer and subclass of assets for when someone like Rockwell, Schweitzer, Schneider, anybody, Cisco, Hirschman, whatever, pulls out notices, updates, or end of life cycle. We can start to look at firmware, et cetera. We can include operational context, like the tribal knowledge of the asset as defined by the operating team, or we can even do calculated fields and start to really build a rich, robust understanding of my assets to be able to make informed decisions. I then want to add to it software, okay? We can put as much software in here as we want. Well, not as much. We grab everything from the endpoint. I want to know software items, unique software items, total installed and unique, and then by publisher. But here's the other thing I'm going to want to do. I want to start looking at questionable software. We did an assessment with our technology. Again, not a paper-based, not a standalone. We actually deploy our technology. And once our technology is out there, we can see all this data, which then lets us pivot into analyzing the data and doing an assessment, not only at that point, but in real time, because we're always updating. And at one particular client, we found 5 dual home systems that were bypassing the firewall between IT and OT, and 4 of those 5 are running TeamViewer. And so the ability to be able to fully understand your assets and as they update in real time. So for example, if a 6th machine got TeamViewer installed, we'd be able to see that. And this allows us to go from reactive or shooting in the dark to having so much data, we can just pivot into any sort of function. We also then want to bring in the vulnerability. So I'm just building the map here of what I showed you, the mouse and the cookie. If I can build inventory of user or of systems, of OS, of software, of users, of vulnerabilities, and of patches, I start to build this multi-dimensional view in a single portal that allows me to pivot between these different components. Many organizations have these bits and pieces of data in different sources. Maybe they are definitive, maybe they're not. I've got a couple of use cases to go through. But this is where we start to build this 3-dimensional view that will make us much more successful. And so, for example, here, we're looking at patches that are associated relative to the vulnerabilities, missing patches by critical, number and severity, by category. But here's also, if you are wanting to look at how you're tracking as a program, the timing, how long have these been released for, right? And so we're looking at anything older than 35 days. This is a NERC SIP requirement, but is also a best practice scenario of we should at least review the patches when they come out, whether we do anything or not, or whether we can, we're at least aware of what's coming out. And so we track when they were released versus when we reviewed them. And are we learning something or able to plan compensating controls or patch cycles for next outages or upgrades, et cetera. So back to my question, based on what I just showed you, have I moved the needle in what you think is an inventory? I don't think it's just a list of IP addresses or even make, model, and manufacturer. I want to know ports and services. We can show you how many default ports and services are in use that could be anonymized or customized and no longer subject to mass vulnerabilities. What about software? We just talked about. What about users? Couple quick case studies. We have a refinery client that found 2 things in their most recent audit. They found 47 dormant administrative accounts, all of which belong to departed employees, some of whom were not let go of their own volition. They also discovered, by being able to look at the group policy inheritance on those assets, that while indeed the setting for changing passwords every 90 days was in effect, the setting that made them change that password was not. And so every 90 days, these operators were changing to the same password for the last 3 years. And so, again, we want to move beyond, a cursory view of what's out there and get to the actual meat. If we're going to do it once, we might as well do it right and maintain it over time. And is the data static? Most people believe that OT is set and forget, but inventory does need to be continually updated. Spares off the shelf, upgrades to software, project-based adjustments. I know I came in after the alarm management team at a Matricon project once that were troubleshooting getting the alarm management working. And they opened a whole bunch of ports in the firewall, and then nobody went back and closed them. So we did an assessment 6 months after our counterparts had been there doing alarm management and OPC connections, and realized that well-intentioned, view into data to run the plant better and more efficiently, unfortunately, introduced a significant security risk that wasn't necessarily understood before or even aware of. And then, like I said, spares versus redundance. Are we going backwards when you bring stuff in? Are we going backwards during projects? Or what about the engineering laptop that comes in and plugs in to update software, either from your own employees or from your contractors? It's actually a fairly dynamic environment. So for me, inventory is that your better program starts with better data, but we need context. And so I fully advocate, as do most of our clients who now have this in place, you want detailed asset specific. So on the first dimension, when I challenged you what an inventory is, I think we were thinking, what do I get from the asset? And that's absolutely fair, but that's only one dimension. You need to get as much data about all your assets as you possibly can from the asset itself. That's the detailed asset specifics. The next thing you need to do is you need to put operational context. This is key tribal knowledge. This could be something as mundane as where does the asset physically sit, or who do I contact to get into that asset? We have an example of a client that wanted to remove a particular version of foreign built antivirus software. They were able, with this particular architecture that we have, to see 146 copies at 6 different locations. They were able to send a command to those devices. Remember, I talked about remediation. The same agent that's profiling those endpoints can help to manage those endpoints. So we sent 146 commands to 146 systems and said, please uninstall the software. However, we did not automatically do that. We're not Big Brother pushing actions into OT. We set a flag that said, make this an offer. And then what I did was I gave a list to each of the 6 sites showing their systems in scope. And I not only showed them the name of the asset, but we were able to show them the floor, the room, the rack it was in, and even the contact person. The technicians in parallel walked to their different sites, all 6 sites, and all of their scoped systems. And they got to the system tray and they saw a flashing light that said, there's a request here for you to take an action. They then phoned the control room and very closely coordinated with operations to uninstall the software, and where required, reboot and bring it back up. And we were able to see at the top, as 146 copies of software were removed safely from 6th generation facilities on a Saturday afternoon in less than 2 hours. And OT had the keys to the kingdom. That level of inventory visibility makes you laser precise and significantly more mature and a much faster path with way less people. The other thing that I advocate, though, over and above, mundane and day-to-day stuff, is third party. So while I can bring you what's on it and what's happening to it, and what its value or importance or location is, other indicators always help. Threat feeds, vulnerability data, antivirus status, backup status, whatever else we can to really build, and interactions between the assets as well for time series, to really build not only what is it, but what's happening to it. And I know I'm straying from inventory into now actions and remediations and protections, but it all comes back to the asset. Anytime you make a decision on any new and emerging risk, and anytime you see any sort of new threat, you need to be able to go back to the context of how big is this and how important is it to me? And I've got a couple slides to show that in a bit here. So what are your options to building these types of inventory, or building an inventory in general? You can do it manually. One of the gentlemen on the call here today still does Excel spreadsheets to some extent with an intern every summer to go and update it and make sure they know what they have. It is basic. It is pretty straightforward. Or you could stitch together from multiple sources. I do have friends at a pipeline company that I'm working with where they use a little bit of everything from SolarWinds to Maximo to SAP to ServiceNow, to the Rockwell Asset Center, and they sort of stitch together what they think they have for an inventory. It's obviously not as robust or rich as the other areas, but it is a path. It is a method that some people have invested in. You can use passive listing tools. There's no shortage of venture capital money and marketing in them. I love them for anomaly detection and alerting. I loathe them for inventory and vulnerability and patch data. It's because they're only able to gather that which they hear for command and control data and even inventory components. In fact, many of them have an active component to go and profile the endpoint, or they initiate a broadcast on the subnet to get things to check in with the asset center, for example, sending a who is on a broadcast, which isn't bad, except it adds unnecessary traffic and still only gets a subset of data. So it's a nice, easy button listening, sort of thing, if you have the span and top port infrastructure. But again, when you start to make informed decisions and detailed analysis, you're going to need to go to other data sources to get the data you really need. And then, of course, there's ours. And, I am biased, but I've also been doing this 20 years. I've been searching for something that's useful, and I think I've found it. We use an agent on anything running an operating system. All the vendors do, for things from antivirus to backup to performance monitoring, et cetera. An agent is a dirty word, but it's really just a piece of software. There's 40, 50, 60, 70 other pieces of software on those devices. The agent gives me up to 1,000 characteristics of the endpoint, as well as lets me manage that endpoint very safely, as the example I just gave you for removing that foreign built antivirus software. In connection with the agent, we use agentless data collection, which is basically mimicking the OEM tools to talk to a Rockwell asset center or to a Cisco firewall or switch. And so we're not in the way of normal bandwidth. If you're talking those devices from the HMI and the asset center 40, 50, 60 times a day, we just add one extra connection on the same administrative protocol and the same administrative channel, ask it the hardware, the firmware, the serial number, pull that offline to a database and start mapping things like vulnerabilities and threats, thereby adding to your protection with existing tool sets and not really having an impact in that environment. So what are the challenges, though, in all three of those? All three of those methods have challenged getting accurate endpoint data from remote locations, right? And so as you get through your various options over there, how do I get from remote? How do I get data from embedded devices? And both Verve and the passive tools are continuing to grow their library of that exact sort of supported protocol to connect to embedded devices, because that data is very important and sometimes hard to get. We can't scan in OT. Vulnerability-based tools like Tenable, Qualys, et cetera, they're really good at understanding application vulnerabilities. They're not necessarily OS-based vulnerabilities, and they're certainly not built for embedded devices like relays, PLCs, and controllers, or even networking gear. In fact, many of my clients only scan IT-looking systems like Windows boxes and domain controllers in OT with scan-based tools under very controlled circumstances. So very periodic, maybe on a lower scan, maybe on the back, the redundant pair, or maybe only during outage. So there's significant gaps in your visibility there. And those are built for discovering vulnerabilities, not inventory, really. There are often changes in this environment. Like I said, it's not as static as we thought. Spares off the shelf. In fact, most of our manufacturing clients have entire lines. When they go to change product spec, they rip out PLCs and bring in the new cart of the other type. So they're building left-handed hockey sticks instead of right-handed. And instead of reprogramming the PLCs, they just bring in a whole set that's ready to go. It's faster. But that means you're bringing a whole new set of IP addresses with different firmwares and potential exploits on them. And there's a lack of labor to do so manually. That example of the removal of software in 90 minutes is light years ahead. We're not going to get armies. Budget for armies to build people to run around and do these things manually. And so automation is a key component. The next challenge is integrating endpoint software data with vulnerabilities and patches. You can have an inventory tool and then a patch tool and then maybe a vulnerability tool, but those are three different tools. And if there's gaps in all three of them, not only are you trying to stitch together half of the information you need, but from three different systems, you start to have lots of holes in your view. And the other thing to notice, and this is where I'm challenging everyone's notion of who owns the system, vendors still carry a fairly outsized stick, I think. They want you to only apply patches that they've approved. But the problem is they only test patches that affect their software. And if you run a Windows OS, you have vulnerabilities outside of what the vendor has approved. Quick example. Did one of these deployments, we pulled up the patch dashboard, we showed 1,200 missing patches on average on Siemens systems. And I'm not picking on Siemens, it just happened to be Siemens for this one. It's the same for Emerson and Honeywell, et cetera. We had Siemens come out and apply all their patches, everything that they'd approved, they sent out the technicians, everything was perfect. We then looked at the patching dashboard after they left, there's still 800 missing patches. And we asked them, they said, well, we don't test those because those are core to Windows, not core to Siemens software. And that's as far as they can go. I used to work at Honeywell. The amount of versions of control systems and software out there, it's just absolutely impossible to test everything. So you test what you can and try to help out. But you as the end user, you have to decide what, if anything, you want to do about those remaining risks. Aligning asset risk with asset criticality impact. I've sort of touched upon this a few times. We're not going to run out when Bluekeep comes and start patching from the top of the alphabet. We need to understand what we need to do in which order. And there's, two different ways of looking at that list. The ones that are considered critical systems to our safe operations, they probably need the most attention the fastest, but they're also the last ones we're going to touch first. The other end of that spectrum, redundant domain controller or a spare file server sitting in the DMZ, that's my first target for putting a patch on and testing and baking and seeing what I can do, whether the vendor approves it or not. And so this notion of being able to align what I have and where I have it to make informed decisions is a very, very key contributor and indicator of how well you can grow your security maturity. And then, of course, compensating controls. This is where it gets really tricky in OT. I can go to show an IT team that I can show vulnerabilities and patches and say, great, we've got all those dashboards already. What they're missing in the fact is it's very difficult to get this data from OT in many cases. And secondly, I'm not going to be able to apply Bluekeep everywhere. I'm probably going to have to apply compensating controls. How do I track those? How do I identify where to put them? And how do I identify if they've been put in? If I'm not getting detailed information about that endpoint, I can run around and apply controls, but how do I know? I know, for example, a large OEM just got a large contract from a large refinery to run around and harden all the systems as per vendor recommendations. When they were done, the vendor went to the plant manager, said, we're all done. The plant manager said, well, how do I know? And the vendor had to say, well, you need to log into the system and look at it relative to our checklist. The plant manager said, but can't I look at a dashboard or report? And the answer was no. They simply did the task. They didn't worry about tracking it. And this is, to me, what most, I've seen these buzzwords in the market that are called virtual patching. This is really where things are coming to for OT, is if I can't apply the patch and I can't update the antivirus signature, maybe I want whitelisting and maybe I want compensating controls, things that are much more suitable to OT. Okay, so overcoming challenges in collecting endpoint data. Context, assets change more frequently than you think. Risk continues to evolve and grow, and assets can be hard to find in profiles we talked about for different topologies and bandwidth limited environments, maybe air-gapped environments, maybe data diodes, etc. But you must go the source, and therefore we need to automate as much as possible. We have a client, for example, that was doing NERC data collection from a critical substation on the side of a mountain. And so once every 30 days, a guy would jump on a truck with a laptop and a serial cable, and he or she would get up to the substation, log in, plug in the serial cable, try to grab all the information from the protective relays there. Hopefully they didn't fat finger the input out from the export from the Schweitzer gateway into the spreadsheet that then eventually made it into their inventory. And then the data sat and aged for 30 days. Now, those are fairly static environments, but is that the most useful spend of time and effort? And is it the most accurate? We worked with that client, Schweitzer, to build a local profiling capability with our own technology. We pushed it out on a parallel 9600 baud serial link outside of command and control data. And now they're getting this automatically updated every 24 hours. Nobody has to drive outside of a mountain. There's no human intervention or manual effort, and we're not in the way of operations. So there are ways to do this. We just need to be creative. We need to be able to navigate complex networks. We have one client who every single generation facility is behind a data diode, and that's a nightmare for compliance. However, compliance can see all the sites from a single dashboard on multiple indicators based on the way we've architected to push data outbound and at least let them see it. We also have to have deference to fragile assets. We don't want to do scan-based tools. We don't want to do broadcasts. We don't want to be pinging devices. And we need to tie asset data to risk and apply context. This is the key. All right. Practical learnings that we have gathered over the last 20 years, and even more so in the last 12 to 18 months, as more and more organizations struggle to keep up with existing regulation, or as we recently saw a flurry of activity in the pipeline industry, emerging regulation. Risk is a subjective measure. It is not necessarily equal to everybody. Just because the NVD says this is a critical risk doesn't mean it's critical to you and your organization. Without context, you can't make informed and intelligent decisions. Risk must be paired with impact and likelihood. And I had a question in the last webinar this morning. How do you determine likelihood? Well, There's no real empirical way to say this is more likely to happen than that. However, in your environment, it's probably easier to say, and you could probably relatively intelligently say that something that is a network-based attack vector on an asset that's in scope in layer 3.5 of the Purdue model, right near the noisy and potentially problematic business network, is probably more likely than a similar system down in layer 2 of the Purdue model with 3 more firewalls between it on a network-based attack vector. Now, that's not empirical, but it allows you to make an informed decision about the quote unquote likelihood of that attacking that particular asset relative to the one in the DMZ. That's why we want to bring you attack vector, attack specifics. Is it availability target or confidentiality? Is it a complex attack? Is it a simple attack, etc.? And to be truly comprehensive, you need to map all 3 classes of assets to those vulnerabilities: embedded devices, networking devices, and OS-based. Now, sometimes the result in OT is often noise, meaning I get a huge number of vulnerabilities, which is not at all uncommon. I recently did this for a midstream gas company. We did a pilot at one of their sites. We brought in the CISO at the end of the pilot to show them the results of the pilot. And the CISO said, "Oh, wow, is that all of our sites?" And we said, "No, that's 2 of 3 subnets at one site." And so we need to be able to filter that. And that's because not all assets are created equal. So I'm going to come back to the vulnerability data. Once I gather the data and I've got criticality of the vulnerability, I've got the impact type of the vulnerability, I've got the asset class of the vulnerability, I can start to make informed decisions. So if I take what is 15, 16,000 vulnerabilities in a typical environment, and I can narrow it down to the 17 I absolutely have to focus on, we become what I call cyber snipers. What I've done is taken the previous slide and I've simply said, only show me the critical risks. So I filtered on critical risks. I then pulled through the tribal knowledge that I say you need to append to these assets, the metadata that says, I only want to look at the high impact assets, assets that we have deemed are high risk to operations if they go offline or we don't have visibility to them. I also want to look at that third-party data. Any of these assets that don't have a current backup or whitelisting isn't in lockdown, so I have safety nets. These 17 become the holy grail of what I need to protect first and foremost. I'm not starting, like I said, at the top of the alphabet. I'm starting with my key components, the crown jewels, as it were, relative to risk, and this helps me to become much more accurate. So what are some of the practical learnings? Patching is not always an option, and OT needs to rely on compensating controls. This means we need to know antivirus whitelisting and backup status, as I just showed you. It also means least privilege or system hardening. This is a proactive move that many organizations are starting to get to, but trying to wrap their head around how to do it, track it, and report on it, as I just indicated, is a challenge. Result, real-time visibility of current configurations further filters risk, and system hardening can be a quick and powerful way to protect against emerging threats. We have a client that for Bluekeep, with our technology, we're able to go from a pre-Bluekeep risk response, about 10 people, 2,500 hours for about 6 weeks. All told, they tracked the number of hours and dollars spent on these people being diverted, and also the opportunity cost of the engineering projects they weren't on. Bluekeep came around. They were able to pre-deploy the Bluekeep file on every endpoint that they knew was in scope because they had this automated inventory. They were able to test patches on the lower impact redundant domain controllers I was just talking about a minute ago, while they prepared to have staff ready to do the high criticality ones. And then the ones they just didn't want to touch, they used compensating controls to disable remote desktop and the guest account. And that was, interestingly enough, highly correlated to 24/7 manned engineering and HMIs that probably didn't need remote desktop or the guest account ever. And so they were able to do a host of automated patching and deployment with OT oversight, but also compensating controls. They got to 95% risk reduction in 70% less time. So that 7-figure exercise prior to this type of architecture resulted in a 70% savings, or almost $700,000. And the other thing about getting this level of data is, as I've alluded to it before, the assessment portion. We don't need to do an annual assessment anymore when I can look at this every day in real time. I can get endpoint data, which is very clear. Is it on there or not? Is the patch present or not? Is the control hardened or not? But we can also see shared passwords, group policy inheritance, like I said about the password. We can also see network violations of communications between different areas. We can see dual home systems. Like I mentioned, that one client, we found 5 dual home systems, 4 of them running TeamViewer. Architecture, remote access. This inventory, quote unquote, allows you to pivot into multiple security disciplines, compliance regulations, or easy answers when the boss phones and says, what about this new Schneider thing? Are we at scope, and how big of a deal is it? Or Log4j, or you name it. We can also see policy and procedure violation, as I mentioned, with dormant admin accounts, shared passwords, and unchanged passwords. It's all facilitated in a particular architecture. As I mentioned, this smaller team up front, which I've given multiple examples, I don't need to continue to beat the dead horse over, but we have a client today that has a team of 8 monitoring 600 facilities globally. And when end of life Windows devices come up, they're able to manage it. When patching comes up, they're able to manage it. They took this same architecture with Log4j, and they discovered everywhere that they were in scope and had remediation plans within a week. Whereas before that, it probably would have taken them a team of 3 or 4, about 6 months. This truly is the future. This real-time feedback loop of inventory and context into informed decision makers that can take context and start to act on it. Really, if you go back to the mouse and the cookie or the cycle, inventory is just the first part of the string you're going to pull on. You're going to need to understand vulnerability patch configuration and what are we going to do about it, right? And this is how you facilitate it without having to build out an army. A couple more slides and we'll switch to question and answer. The best part about having that view is that the real-time feedback means you're always looking at current status, right? And this is just a small snippet of a CISO dashboard we have with some of the higher value views. The first is critical vulnerability. This is from a client who decided they wanted to build thresholds. They have actual behaviors tied to each of the score. So between 0 and 1,000 for critical vulnerabilities, totally aggregate, they have 30 days to get working on these. If they're in the yellow, they have 2 weeks or 2 business weeks, so 10 business days. I know they're 24/7, but they try to stick to when there's max staff on. And if they get to the red, they need to act within 3 business days and start to get numbers back down into another range. But this is where we're starting to take data and we're informing programmatic decisions, which also impact staff, budget, support mechanisms, models, et cetera. One of the funniest things I find is that when OT or CISO or upper management says, well, that's a lot of money for OT, I automatically ask, well, how many assets are being managed by how big of an IT budget on the IT side? And then let's compare that to OT. And a lot of people have never done that. And I don't mean to be glib or offensive, but we've got hundreds and thousands of assets that make lots of money and actually protect lives and some spinning equipment in higher volatile environments. We cannot cheap out on cybersecurity. And if I have a way to show not only that we're making progress, but how big the problem is in the first place, we're then starting to have empirical and informed decisions as opposed to conjecture and hyperbole and guesses and arguments. This is a calculated score. We can take different indicators. Is it a critical asset? Does it have critical vulnerabilities? And does the backup run or not? And give an actual calculated score. So we don't just do a raw measure of something that may or may not be important. We can actually build our own dynamics and metrics and measure all of our assets against it. And then we can also see patch levels. We could go down to vulnerabilities, configurations, users, et cetera. So how do we adapt our current method? Because likely everyone here is already invested, manual or otherwise, in some sort of data collection and program. And there's value in IP in that data. Our recommendation is to build and design your desired inventory. Start with the end in mind. What does done look like? You may need to grow into that and retire some other tools that maybe aren't as comprehensive so that we're not ripping and replacing or throwing out investment. We want to make sure that we capture any IP that are in those solutions, like metadata. A lot of Maximo or maintenance databases have, deploy dates and contact information of the owner, the user, the location, et cetera. And so we want to capture that before we maybe retire it or turn it back to what it's used for. We want to make sure that we have leverage existing investments in antivirus, whitelisting, or backup data. And any sort of corporate data we're bringing in around threat intel or vulnerabilities, we want to continue to adapt and pull into this as well. And then, of course, we can develop tasks and views to any single department. Are you the person in charge of patching? Are you the person in charge of analyzing vulnerabilities in its scope? Or are you the compliance officer and want to see what we have for users or the audit team? So 2 last slides, and I'll switch to any questions. inventory is the key to everything, but inventory is only as good as the data you collect. I have no less than 7 major global organizations that I'm at various stages of proposal and document and POC with that either failed an audit or have been less than successful in trying to go the easy route, working backwards from a stitched together set of data sources, using passive tools to get all the data they need. They realize that if they really truly want insight, they need to go to the endpoint. Like I said, don't trust what you hear, go to the source. Data collection does need to be automated because it will change. Whether that's Log4j comes out and new intel comes out and you're trying to overlay on your environment, or whether that's changes within the environment itself. Data needs to cover multiple parameters, depth of data, which we've talked about at length, but also the breadth of data, all assets in your scope. And OT context is paramount to risk management. That which is critical in OT or different in OT is maybe not the same in IT, and it's certainly not the same in different zones or segments of an OT environment, or even in various sections of your process. Static, what it is, and transactional, what it is doing, or data are equally important. But the ability to act on information is critical. All this effort to do an assessment or to get an inventory and understand vulnerabilities, but then no tools to do anything about it. That's my other challenge with a passive tool. Passive tools are actually engineered to monitor you when something's wrong. And as a byproduct, they see things talking to each other and say, well, here's your inventory. But that's putting things backwards. When a passive tool goes off, that's the equivalent of your fire alarm going off. Your fire alarm is ringing, you are on fire. And so without having, and they have no ability to do anything about it, they tell you about it. They're the alerting service, which is a fantastic service to have. Like I said, I believe in the canary when I go into the coal mine, but if you don't have the tools to do something about it, then all the information in the world is effectively useless. But a real-time update, reporting and tracking is a fundamental need if we're going to succeed in a growing face of technology and risk relative to a not so growing army and workforce to be able to combat it. So my key takeaways, think ahead. What are you going to want to do with an inventory, right? If you look back at the mouse and the cookie, guaranteed it's not just enough to have a list of IP addresses. You're going to be asked multiple other things down the road, either immediately or not long after. You need to integrate multiple data sources and build what we call a 360-degree view or a 3-dimensional view of an asset. And that means 3 different data sources. There is the asset itself, there is third-party indicators, and then there's your tribal knowledge and the investment you have in your 10s and 20 and 30 decades of operating experience in your staff that play in there 24/7 and know when they hear something start to go off, that's a big deal or it's no big deal. You need that metadata, you need that context. As I've said before, don't trust what you hear, go direct to the source. Have an eye towards remediation. Think global and act local is a really, really powerful way to look to the future for managing risk in OT. And wherever possible, automate the collection and update ability. Being able to look real time at what I have and whether I'm improving or regressing is a huge, huge indicator of success, but also continued support and success going forward. So in the Q&A, I see a couple notes from my friend Rod, which we'll get to a little bit later. If there's any others, that's in the chat rather. I don't see any in the Q&A, but we did have some preloaded ones. Can you please talk a little bit more about metadata? Yeah, Saeed, this is everything else I might need to know about the asset that I'm not going to get from the asset or from a third-party data source like antivirus or whitelisting or backup. So when I have a list of inventory, the first thing I'll do is I'll export it into an Excel sheet with you, and we'll put on as many columns as you want for you to put data that you can't glean physically or logically from the asset. So I'm going to want to start with a big one, which is what is the asset's impact to operations? In other words, if this is a critical engineering station, I want that critical tag on that asset. So when I'm looking at vulnerabilities, I know how to handle that particular one or what order of priority it needs to be in there. But I'm also going to want to know other indicators of that asset. Like, is it redundant? Is it in this particular unit? If I've got a larger complex environment like a refinery or a coal-fired generation facility with multiple floors in the building, do I want to know which floor it's on, which room it's in, which rack it's in? Do I want to know the owner of it when we're talking SCADA deployments and pipeline or T&D? I may have some people in the region, or I may have some trusted vendors that I dispatch to go and do reboots and troubleshoot on my remote pump stations and terminals. And so all sorts of contact info to allow for speedy response or enhancement. Those are some of the things you'd want to put in metadata. It's stuff that you can, that you have in your operators' brains or notebooks, but that may not be able to be gathered from the asset or from a vulnerability database or a patch database. So that's a good question. Thank you. And I'm just going to go ahead to the next. So by the way, anybody who wants to get a hold, here is some contact information for me on our website. So please go ahead and take note of that. I'm just going to switch to, for a couple of minutes here, there were some previous questions that were sent in prior. What would be the critical information to be recording the OT asset inventory listing? Great question. Pretty much everything I've highlighted here, those three main categories, everything more that I can know about the asset itself, as well as whatever metadata we can gather about it, and as well as third-party data like risk, vulnerability, threat data, et cetera. Tools we use in the link between IT and OT assets in CMDB. Well, Anil, thank you for that question. We build what I would call an authoritative source of data. And once we build that authoritative source, we have the ability to integrate with various CMDBs so that we can, for example, ServiceNow, so we can give to the enterprise an overall view of all assets on both sides of the firewall. In some cases, we're actually taking our OT inventory, we're pushing it to ServiceNow. As an example, we also integrate with Cherwell and Jira and others. We have a full REST API. But the idea is that what we did here was we wanted to take this authoritative source of data, bring it to the corporate CMDB, get a unique identifier so that the corporate could look at lifecycle planning and economic write-downs and tax write-offs and coverage, et cetera. And that's how we would integrate with the CMDB. So we'd build an authoritative source from the OT side of the firewall and then share it on the IT side. Next question, is it better to use technology to discover assets initially or an on-the-ground physical exercise? Well, I think I've covered that one, but just to be clear, on-the-ground physical exercise, on the ground exercise, it is a point in time. It may be faster. I don't think it'll be as exhaustive, and it will start to age. We've been suggesting to clients, if they want an assessment, they actually do a pilot of our product for 6 months. We put it in, we get all this data, we show them how to remediate with it, show them how to grow with it, and you get much, much richer data. And 9 times out of 10, they just keep it, because not only does it give them the inventory, but it gets them 3, 4, 5 steps down that multi-year roadmap. Many paper-based assessments start with an assessment, procurement, 3 bids and a buy. People come to site, run around, do the work, write a report, send it over. That report then becomes the genesis for next year's budget and 3 bids and a buy and cycle, et cetera. And you get to some risk reduction and remediation, probably 15, 18, maybe 24 months from the first day we decided to do an assessment. Maybe you're faster, but maybe not by a lot. Whereas this approach, when we did this with a large consumer packaged goods manufacturer, within the 3rd site, we came back to the first one to show management our findings, and the local team had already reduced about 50% of the immediate risk. When I say immediate, there's 3 horizons of risk that you typically find. There's the low-hanging fruit, dormant users, software that's not necessary, system configuration you can do. There's a medium horizon, which is things like maybe redesigning your network topology, your remote access policies and technologies, maybe your backup solution, for example. And then there's a long-term horizon, which is life cycle and digital twin, et cetera. So they remediate about 50% of that first horizon of risk almost immediately. So there's some significant benefits and acceleration to your maturity if you put technology in. How to implement IDS in OT domain and intrusion detection systems. So there's multiple. One of the things I didn't get into here, and we'll probably take offline for that one, is that we do time series data. So I tie all the stuff I have by being on the asset, like the Windows event log, system health, CPU spike, network, memory card, et cetera, with NetFlow and syslog, and then I put that into 300 different SIM and machine learning capabilities. How to ensure IT-OT convergence? That's a great one. So you ensure IT-OT convergence when you bring together data and you basically expect that IT is going to be looking at the vulnerability and the risk and the potential mechanisms for remediation And then the options are given to OT to say, well, I can live with that in OT, or that's an acceptable path. And you start to build this best of both worlds. We actually, for many clients, are doing a workshop where we talk exactly about this. What does IT do? What does OT do? What does different job descriptions try to do? And it's facilitated and executed by that think global, act local approach. It's really, really quite powerful. And as I mentioned, our global pharma client is on pace to go from over 1.1 on a particular event a couple of years ago to about 285 in the most recent one. That's a 70 to 75% reduction in effort, and is 100% facilitated by both the architecture and the technology gathering to bring to these two small specialized groups. But then for IT to give recommendation, OT to give the blessing, and then the architecture to go ahead and execute as much of it as automatically as possible. We have another live question. One more question. Do you have a capability check who is speaking to which device and there's suspicious connection to a PLC? Yeah, with all the NetFlow logging and characteristics, as well as some of the machine learning capability shows if there's changes in direction, change in communication, either by a large volume or a different direction or to a different endpoint you've never seen before. Anonymous attendee, how do you discover level 1 assets, things like controllers and IDs? What ICS vendors do you cover? Honeywell, Emerson, Yokogawa, et cetera? Do you send traffic directly to controllers? So the agentless device profiling is where I would connect, and I'll keep it to something that's a little more simple. We do support everyone that you're talking about there, as well as others. What I would typically do, for example, in a Rockwell or Schweitzer. So Rockwell, I will talk to the Rockwell rack with a SIP protocol on a SIP port 44818 like Rockwell uses. And I will ask it the same administrative or profile commands that the asset center is going to ask it. We've proven this actually in Rockwell Labs. We can get to the chassis, we can get all the cards in the chassis, and we can even use SIP pathing to get the serial connected backplane. So we're able to do that. Schweitzer and other, I mentioned Schweitzer because sometimes they have head-end devices that actually act as an upstream, whether that's cellular modems for T&D deployments, or whether that's a gateway for managing multiple downstream relays or RTACs. We're able to gather data from that and again, get serially connected devices in behind that. So it depends on the technology, how we do it, but it's effectively us mimicking the vendors' approved technologies, protocols, and commands, so that we're not broadcasting, we're not scanning, we're hitting multiple ports on the IP. We're actually behaving just like it's been engineered to do so. So in your experience, how long does it take to perform complete inventory for one power generation facility? I can always go faster than our operating friends can. If we have all of the credentials and firewall rules in place, an average generation facility, I'm thinking of 4x450. If it's coal-fired, it's a little bit more complex, usually because of all the different subnets, but a couple, 3 weeks max, and then you've got it baked in and it's automated inventory from that point forward. If you're cleaner, you're like a gas-fired or a combined cycle or something, we can probably do that in about a week or so. We can deploy 300, 400, 500 agents at a time. The challenge comes from getting credentials. The challenge comes from getting firewall rules from the network support team. And then the third challenge comes from making sure the local operational staff are comfortable with what we're doing. So we do a crawl, walk, run scenario. I'm first going to talk to a Rockwell device. I'm going to see by the IP and MAC address, it's probably Rockwell. I can see by the ports, it's probably Rockwell. I'm going to send a telnet hello on port 20 to see if I get a response to confirm it's Rockwell. And then I'm going to connect to the Rockwell, and all of that's going to be shown in very slow and methodical method to the operational team locally. Once they're comfortable with what we're doing, we can go faster, but it's usually situational on the environment we're in. Last question, should we consider performing inventory for level 0 devices? If they are available, you should. Excuse me. However, a lot of the technologies at that level don't inventory well, and you almost need to go to a third-party source. We have clients who are exporting from head-end devices managing multiple downstream layer 0, and we can import those in bulk. You don't necessarily get the same vulnerability mapping, but you do certainly get firmware and the version and number and location, which helps with a lot of risk reduction and remediation plans. So